Welcome to today's webcast. The topic for today is techniques for medical text analytics. Can get started here with a quick look at our agenda. So I've kept the agenda pretty simple. We'll start with some introductions to myself and to Thorogood. We'll then start with some exploration of medical text at a high level. So where does it come from? What does it look like? How can we use it? All those sorts of things. From there, I'll take us through some of the technical possibilities around medical text analytics. So what are some common techniques that we can use? What are some tools that are out there to help us? And then we will wrap up from there. So like I said, we'll get started here with some introductions. My name is Scott Stieritz, and I'm a data and analytics consultant with Thorogood, and I'm based out of the US. I've worked on a number of projects recently that have been at some of our pharmaceutical customers, starting to look at some of this medical text data. So it's a topic I find really interesting. I'm happy to have a chance to talk with you all about it today. As far as Thorogood's an independent specialist data and analytics consultancy. So within data and analytics, our consultants are experienced and have skills across the areas of data engineering, data science, and data visualization. And our services similarly span the breadth of this whole data and analytics space. So that's everything from architecture, design, and implementation to specific solution design and development, to hands-on advanced analytics, data science services, all the way through to things like user empowerment and training and key data and analytics topics for the people in our customers' organizations. We at Thorogood are a global organization. So the company's based out of London. I mentioned that I'm joining today from the US, where we have offices in both Philadelphia and Boston, and we have other offices globally in Singapore, Sao Paulo, and Bangalore. I mentioned that we're an independent consultancy, so we're therefore not tied to one specific technology. Instead, we have a range of experiences across the breadth of the data and analytics space, including the major technology players within that space. I put a few of them on the screen here today. We feel that this independence allows us to not focus on the technology in particular. Rather, we can understand the business goals of our customers, and we can understand that in combination with our experience in the technical possibilities across these range of offerings to identify what the optimal solution might be for that specific customer and that specific business case. So in some of the demos today, we're going to see some tooling from AWS. So we are an AWS partner, but we also partner with many of the other major providers that you can see up on the screen. So like I said, let's keep introductions short. We can move on to focus a bit more on what our main topic is for today, which is medical text, including what it is, what types of things we can do with it, everything like that. So I think as far as an overview of medical text data, it's probably helpful to look at the breadth of this data by thinking about all the different sources from which we can get access to or from which we might run into medical text data. So medical text data itself is like narrative, put on the screen, natural language, textual data, which addresses care of patients or maybe medical conditions of patients, medical histories of patients. So things related to people, things related to the healthcare of those people, and specifically the textual data from those sources. So you might see data coming in from EHR systems or electronic health record systems. And these are systems that are intended to be digital versions of patients' medical histories. So that could include everything from past procedures to current and past prescriptions, all the measurements and lab results and everything like that that's collected over the course of the care of that patient. That could be radiology and pathology reports, notes from healthcare providers, discharge summaries, demographic data, tons of different things that can go into these EHRs. There's also clinical research. So this is a pretty diverse category of medical text data sources here. We could run into anything from physician commentary from healthcare encounters over the course of clinical trials to patient survey data, maybe to observational study data, and much more. We also might run into medical text within IoT devices or smart devices, especially with some of the focus of those devices on the medical field in the past number of years. And there's much more beyond these three. As far as medical text data, we got a quick look at where we might run into it or where it might come from. But what does this data look like? Well, first of all, it's semi-structured or unstructured, meaning there's not one specific schema into which this data always fits. It's often kind of up to the interpretation of the person entering the data in some instances as to how they might categorize certain things, how they might describe certain things. We can think of it as a little bit more free-flowing than, let's say, a table full of integers that we might see in some other like data and analytics use cases. I probably don't even need to mention this one. It's very sensitive. So we have things like personal health information about individuals that are probably captured within the text data. And one of the challenges in particular is that, let's say we have a field in another data and analytics use case that contains someone's social security number. Well, that's okay. You know that field in particular is sensitive. But for medical text data, especially because it can be unstructured, there's often instances where we don't know if there is identifiable information contained within that text. So we also might need to think about some approaches for determining when those PHI type entities are occurring within our text. Medical text data is also high cardinality. I mean, as you would probably assume from any text data that you would run into, meaning, we're not selecting from a drop-down list of 5 or 6 options here. It's natural language, it's text that's being input, let's say, from physicians, from other people. So there are lots of different ways that we could categorize this data, lots of different distinct values that are going to be occurring within our data, which can present a lot of challenges downstream when we go to try to incorporate this data into our analyses. It can also be inconsistent. So this might be dependent on healthcare providers and their own training and experience. One provider might use one set of terminology to describe something. Another provider who maybe grew up in a different area or received training in a different area might use entirely different terminology, but describing the exact same occurrence or something within a patient. So we might not see consistency or alignment of the values across all the different sources that we're looking at. In fact, we almost certainly will not. Kind of on a similar topic, it can be error prone. So we're talking about, in some instances, text that is manually input from individuals, let's say into EHRs or filling out surveys as part of clinical trials, anything like that. So it's subject to human error, as you might expect. It's also technical. So these aren't common terms that we might run into in just everyday conversation. There are important sets of medical terminology that are going to be referenced pretty often and will probably update pretty frequently as medicine evolves over time. So it's important to stay on top of the terminology that's contained within this medical text data. And lastly, it's pretty nuanced. So let's say concepts like negation, where we might say someone is allergic to something or they are not allergic to something. We're going to use many of the same words within those sentences within that text data. That little knot, that nuance is extremely important in getting accurate representation of the concepts that are being described within this data. So I feel like in that last slide, I probably talked about a number of the different challenges of the data, reasons that it might be difficult to work with. And I would like to emphasize that there are use cases that are successfully making use of medical text data. One is computer-assisted coding. So the generation of medical codes from clinical records. This could be for the purpose of identifying appropriate attributes for billing, improving billing accuracy, all those types of things. Kind of on a related note, we could think about medical text data being used for fraud detections. This is sort of a build upon that CAC concept, the computer-assisted coding concept. So we might develop models which detect fraudulent billing practices based on things like procedures or prescriptions or medical history, which we can find within that text data. So activities that are reported as performed but don't match the expected behaviors based on information that we have on patients' history or conditions. Maybe focusing a little bit more on the clinical trial side or the drug development side, we could think about cohort identification and patient enrollment. So finding patients who would be fitting candidates for a clinical trial can be a really onerous process. It can be particularly difficult for rare diseases and disorders. Investigators might be limited in the reach of their own networks, with which they're, of course, more familiar and can more easily assess for a presence of those disorders of interest for, whatever the study might be. And they also might be limited in their ability to scale. So especially when it comes to manual record and document review, it might be difficult to identify big sets of people. And those big sets of people are what are important to give these types of clinical trials the power that they need to determine the efficacy of drugs or medical devices or anything like that. So instead, text analytics can be used in this area to programmatically review the electronic information that's captured about our patients, can identify candidates for a study from the wider population, and it can even begin to evaluate those patients against a study's defined inclusion and exclusion criteria. We also might use medical text data for adverse events identification. So this kind of comes out of the pharmacovigilance area of the drug development process, in which the immediate identification of problems with or reactions to drugs or medical procedures or anything like that is crucial, not only in providing appropriate care for the people who are directly affected by those events, but also in the continued evaluation of the safety and the efficacy of those drugs or devices or procedures. So we can use information like physician notes or diagnoses or discharge summaries, which is often text data, to more rapidly identify instances in which a medical encounter might imply the presence of an adverse event. Next up, we have use of text data within public health research. So maybe there's a disorder of interest, which one is looking to track across populations, or maybe go in the other direction, a population of interest, and one's looking to identify patterns of disorders which have otherwise gone unaddressed within that population. So text analytics can help in this field by allowing the scaling of this research, the scaling of review of medical literature, maybe a combination of other studies, all those types of things. And finally, maybe a bit more closely related to direct care of patients, we can look at physician note summaries and analysis. So, maybe being able to build a system that can look through somebody's medical history and summarize it so that it's easily interpretable. It captures all the important information within that history. It can be read quickly in order to deliver the right care for that patient. So that was an overview of medical text data, what it is, where it might come from, ways that we can use it, all those sorts of things. From here, we're going to take a look at some of the technical possibilities. So I'll start with an overview. And one of the important concepts to distinguish, I think, when we're looking at medical text data or medical text analytics is thinking about, are we looking at information extraction, or are we looking at feature engineering? So are we thinking about how can we look through a body of text and point to the important concepts? And under feature engineering, how can we take that identification of the important concepts and transform it in a way that's usable by some of the analytic algorithms that we might end up using? So under information extraction, we have a number of different topics which can come up commonly here. So things like named entity recognition, where we're, like I said, pointing out the important entities within a body of text. Relationship inference, so not only being able to identify, say, this is a medication and this is a diagnosis that occur in two separate areas within a body of text, but rather, oh, this is the medication that was prescribed because of that diagnosis. So being able to kind of draw lines between the entities that are identified within this data. We can also think about medical terminology classification and mapping. So I mentioned earlier, like the inconsistency of terminology that might be used within medical text data because it is often free text entry type data. So being able to take those terms which might have the same meaning, but themselves are different terms, and map them to a common vocabulary or a common dictionary. There's plenty of dictionaries that are out there that are commonly used, like SNOMED or Medra or plenty of others. Being able to map those terms can be really useful in reducing, let's say, some of the features that we might include downstream within our analyses. And lastly, maybe something around section or context identification. So within a document, you might have a few different sections where one is on the patient's medical history, one is on like impression of the patient, one is chief complaint from the patient, could be a few different areas. So it's important for the approaches that we're taking to be able to identify that context in which entities might be occurring or some of that text is written, to understand the relationship between the text itself and the actual situation affecting that patient or whatever the subject is. And then separately, if we look at feature engineering, number of different techniques, and certainly not enough time within the webcast today to go into detail on each of these techniques, but we have things like one-hot encoding or bag of words or term frequency, inverse document frequency, embeddings, all those types of things that are kind of commonly used with text data that are applicable here as well. But there are some things that we'll need to look out for. So I mentioned the high cardinality of the data, and we'll want to make sure we're striking an appropriate balance between maintaining the difference between the different values that we might, or the differences among the different values that we might be getting, and having too many features for it to be relevant. So let's say we have one field where we have 1,000 distinct features and we try to one-hot encode that. And we have a couple of other features that are included beyond that one field that we've effectively pivoted up. Well, especially when we look at some algorithms that look at subsamples of or subsets of the columns that we might use. So things like random forests or boosted random forest algorithms, we might run into problems when we're effectively more heavily weighting that one field which has been blown out via one-hot encoding versus some of the other fields which might be of equal importance but will be occurring less often within our feature set. So it's important to strike that right balance between the level of detail that we want to get to and the cardinality within the data or some of the downstream effects on our modeling. And lastly, some consideration around feature interpretability. So how important is it to you that you be able to look back at the models and identify these are the specific features that we've put into it? This is the real world meaning of those features versus being okay with something that's a little bit more black box where it's not quite clear how exactly the features have been transformed. That's sort of handled by the model itself, like in neural network type analyses. But as long as the output of that is valuable, then that's all you need. So another important balance to strike there. As far as high level approaches, we could think about things like custom development, where we can get the ultimate flexibility. We can focus specifically on the problem at hand. On the flip side, there's some bottleneck this introduces. So first of all, high barrier to entry. We need to know a lot about the algorithms. We need to develop and train those algorithms ourselves, which can lead to, say, an annotation bottleneck where you're trying to develop this training set, but need to go through the effort of annotating the training data with the appropriate target that you're trying to address within your model. So we could have limited training data sets if we're trying to do everything by hand, which can give us a limited view of the world, maybe it'll be a little bit less generalizable to other use cases that we haven't seen within the training data. On the other hand, we could look at pre-trained services for helping us with medical text analytics. So this is subject to the functionality that's built into the tool. It's a little bit less customizable and flexible and extensible as we would see custom development of medical text analytics approaches or algorithms. But this will introduce a much lower barrier to entry, or I guess will have a much lower barrier to entry than we might see in some of the custom development approaches. We could also see training across a wider range of data within these pre-trained services, which might make the solution, like I said, a little bit more generalizable, a little bit more future-proof as our solution evolves over time. And on the other hand, of course, we'll probably be subject to a little bit of additional fees or licensing costs, depending on the tooling that we pick. So as far as those kind of pre-trained services or those available AI services that are out there are a number that are available within the data and analytics space. There's things like GCP's Cloud Healthcare NLP, Natural Language Processing API. There's Azure Cognitive Services, Text Analytics for Health. There's Amazon Comprehend Medical. And what these services are trying to do is offer some pre-canned ability to pass some medical text data to these services and allow them to interpret it for you, provide back some relevant information that you might be interested in within that text. So we're going to take a look at some of these services now, or I guess specifically the Amazon Comprehend Medical service. So I have some sample medical text data here. It's not, actually representative of real individuals, but we have things like brief description, we have the medical specialty to which the text data is related, but we have something here like some physician notes about these patients that might be, brought out of an EHR, let's say. So in this first row, we have a female is complaining about some allergy symptoms and is looking to have those addressed. So I might want to use some of this pre-canned kind of AI service functionality that's available to me. So just for demonstration, I'll grab this medical text transcription field right here, and I can flip over to my other screen. I have a friendly UI for Amazon Comprehend Medical, and I've just pasted that same data in here. And this is mostly used, as a demo from AWS. This wouldn't necessarily be a productionized solution. But when I paste that in, we can already see the identification of key entities within this data set. So we can see the patient's age and address. We can see diagnoses. We can see medicines that person might be taking. We can also see the mapping of some of these concepts to some of those more standardized libraries like I was talking about. So RxNorm for medications, or ICD-10, which is common for medical procedure encoding type activities, SNOMED, which is another medical dictionary. So, in this instance, a reference to a specific medicine that was given to this patient and the dosage that was provided and the duration over which that patient's going to be taking the medicine. So showing not only some of the important entities, but also the relationships among those entities. So again, this is interesting to look at. It's kind of cool to drop in some of the info here and see what this tool can do with it. Like I said, it's not exactly a productionized solution here. So what I've done next within this demo is try to get us a little bit closer to something that feels productionized. So I've dropped within the bronze layer, let's say, of my data lake here, that same medical text file just to be picked up by some of the analyses here. And then within Glue Studio, I have created AWS Glue, which is an ETL tool, a data transformation tool that's built on top of Spark. I've created a job here to analyze my data a little bit. So I've loaded in the data here just into a data frame within Glue. I've read in that empty samples file here. I've just shown, for the purpose of this demo, the top couple rows, looking at that same description of the patient complaining about allergies and looking for some treatment. And I've filtered down the data set here a little bit to focus on medical history and physical exams, so narrowing in the types of medical text that I might be looking at. And then the real interesting part, I would say, happens under this process text thing. So we can see a line that's in here of just this infer Rx norm. So in this use case, maybe I want to look through my patients and see any of the medications that they've taken over time. And I can actually, reference some of the Amazon Comprehend Medical API information. In this case, I've used the Python SDK in order to access this API. And I'm using this infer Rx norm method here, which is a process within Comprehend Medical which identifies occurrences of medications coming up within medical text and maps those to normalized names and codes in that Rx norm dictionary. So we can see, I guess probably need to restart some of these processes. We can see some of this data which is loaded in. And once I process the text, I can also create a data frame from the results that I have here. So mapping of things like the original medication name as it had occurred within the original medical text to that normalized name based on, some inference that the Amazon Comprehend Medical service is doing, as well as Rx norm medication codes. So this gives us, an actual ID that we can go into that dictionary and look it up. That way, if we're thinking about things like feature engineering and want to roll to higher levels of a hierarchy, something like that, we have the ability to kind of navigate through that dictionary using this code, as well as some sense of confidence. So how confident the Comprehend Medical Service is in whether or not it's correctly identified the appropriate Rx norm medication that ties to the medication entity that was found within the data. And then, of course, writing out some of this. So within that data lake, I've just taken this and written it out to the silver layer, where I've created a separate set of Parquet files here that focus on the medications that are identified within that medical text. So that was a quick look at some of the technical possibilities, especially the ones that are available to us through services like Comprehend Medical or some of the others from Azure or GCP or a number of others within the space that I mentioned earlier. I know we're running a bit short on time here, so I wanted to finish with some additional considerations around medical text analytics. One is on the data architecture. We focused almost entirely on text data in the conversation today, and text data can contain a ton of information, but it really only gives us one lens into the situation that patient is in. Where we can really start to see value is when we can combine that text data with the other pieces of data that we might have about that patient. So that might be genomics data that we've collected from samples in a clinical trial or through other sample processing. It could be lab results, it could be imaging, it could be streaming data from medical devices, all those sorts of things that we want to make sure we have a data architecture that can support the ingestion and combination of all those different types of data sources. So data architecture that surrounds this text analytics is pretty important. Data privacy regulations, I think this is probably an obvious one, but thinking about the sensitivity of this data, we want to make sure that the architecture and the approaches that we're taking are fitting for the regulations that we might be subject to. So that could be dependent on the consents that have been obtained from patients to use and process their data and how that data might be processed or what it might be used for, all those types of things that can be influential factors here and how we handle that. Kind of along that same line of thinking, we are talking about the application of AI services or AI services or custom AI models to real patients, real health information, making a real impact on, people's medical or healthcare in the real world. So we want to think about making sure that we're doing this responsibly, making sure that we are servicing different subsets of the population in equitable ways, all those types of things. I mentioned a little bit earlier that interpretability is a key consideration here, and a similar point on change management. So what we might be introducing into our organizations when we think about things like medical text analytics and updating the ways that we might be running certain analyses from things that probably historically were a little bit more manual and subjective to things that are programmatic, sometimes feel a little bit more black box. So we want to think about how interpretable the results are and how we are going to bring the people that are going to consume this information along for the journey. So are they immediately going to trust the outputs of some of the models that we're building? Or do we need to, start with the simple model, start with something that's a little bit more rules-based and evolve the sophistication of that model over time to bring them along for that journey, to build the buy-in and build the confidence in them in whatever this new solution might be. That brings us to the end of today's webcast. I've put my contact info up on the screen. So if you have any further questions or thoughts coming out of this, feel free to reach out. Happy to chat more. That is all for today. Thank you all very much for joining.